My name is Sefer Mohattes, and I'm the president of the Waterloo Public Interest Research Group, or as it's known, Wpirg. Before anything else, let us just remind ourselves that as we gather under this roof here tonight, we are actually on occupied territory. We are on the occupied land of 6 nations, and being students of this university, we are actually part of the settler project that is known as Canada. So let us just keep that in mind in all our efforts and all we do. This panel is presenting Dr. Doroughs, who is the chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She is also an assistant professor of political science at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. We're also pleased to have Dr. Gabriel Piterberg, who's a professor of history at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. And then also we are pleased to have Dr. Sarah Matthews, who's the assistant professor of global studies at the Wilfrid Laurier University. So this event has been put together and organized by the Palestine Solidarity Action Group, as well as the Grand River Indigenous Solidarity Group, which are both action groups of the Waterloo Public Interest Research Group, Wpirg. I'm going to pass the podium, the mic, to Zainab, who's going to moderate this panel tonight for us. Zainab Ramahi is a senior student in knowledge integration and political science here at UW. So please.
Thank you. Okay, so this is working, right? Yes, thank you again for coming. I am personally delighted to be welcoming you all here. I think this is going to be a very important event. We're honored to have incredibly educated, knowledgeable, and activist speakers joining us. So we're very excited that you're here. So it's in your programs, but I want us all to be on the same page. So I'm going to read out that section under settler colonialism so we understand what tonight is really about. So the field of study, settler colonialism unmasks attempts to create settler narratives in which the identity and institutions of the settler nation is separated from settler-indigenous relations. Scholar Patrick Wolf argues that most pivotal and fundamental aspect of the settler nation is the dispossession and elimination of indigenous peoples. And it is in this framework that They Came in Ships, the event that you are here for tonight, tries to explore European settlement of Canada, the idea of Zionism as a form of settler colonialism, and resistance to attempts to gloss over settler violence. So we'll start with 5 to 10 minute presentations from each of our speakers. We'll be beginning on my left with Dalee, followed by Gabi, and then Sarah. I would just ask, I don't want to interrupt you in between each presentation, so just go ahead once the former speaker is finished. We'll then move into a 45-minute moderated question-and-answer period. So if you are thinking of questions that you would like to ask the speakers during that time, but just ask that you write them down for now. It'll be a mostly theoretical discussion, trying to establish the parallels among the different types of settler colonialism that are being discussed and the different work that each of our panelists is doing. And then we will give you the opportunity to get into a more grounded and practical discussion during about half hour of audience Q&A. We'll have the mic set up, and we ask that, of course, as always, that you be respectful of each other, the time and energy of our panelists, and hopefully we can all contribute to making this a very meaningful event. So without further ado, thanks to you for coming, and we'll get started with Dalee.
The first thing that I want to say is, trust me, I have different jackets. Just a coincidence. I, first of all, want to also acknowledge the original owners of this territory, the 6 Nations people, and if there are any in the audience, thank you for the welcome to your territory. I want to start out with a quote from Robert A. Williams, Professor Williams, who teaches at University of Arizona College of Law in Tucson, Arizona. And he, by all accounts, is the leading indigenous expert on the European conception of law. And one of his volumes, The American Indian in Western Legal Thought, is an important piece of work that drills into the source of much of what we find ourselves as indigenous peoples today struggling with in terms of settler colonialism and its impacts, the legacy of that, its impacts upon indigenous peoples throughout North America, throughout the Americas, but across the globe as well. In his volume, The American Indian and Western Legal Thought, he states, law, which Europeans have long revered as their instrument of civilization, became the West's perfect instrument of empire in the heart of the darkness that was America. And when he says America, he means the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. And what I want, my main message this evening, and by the way, I should say I sort of parachuted into this event just by coincidence, thanks to Professor Habib in the corner here. I crashed the Meet the Prof night on Tuesday and ended up meeting her, and all of a sudden, here I am. My main message is indigenous peoples have been largely subjugated and dominated through the use of law, as Professor Williams states. And if you consider the law of nations, and if you consider it as an indigenous person, I mean, imagine sitting back with Hugo Grotius or Francisco de Vitoria, and you're an indigenous leader. You're a faith keeper from Haudenosaunee. You know, their view, and it's maintained to this day, as many of you may know, that they are nations. They consider themselves nations. The Six Nations, the Navajo Nation, even the Maori people. They may not use the term nation and spray that English word into the air, but that's what they regard themselves as. And if you think about the formal terminology of the nation state, indigenous peoples across the globe have all the attributes of a nation state, right? They have a shared culture, language, customs, practices, and institutions. They have a territory that oftentimes they fiercely defended. Even my own people, the Inuit, across the Russian Far East, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, you know, we fiercely defended our hunting territory. We know about the fierce struggles that were undertaken in defense of territory. Also, they had forms of governance, forms of social control. You know, natives weren't just running around and, you know, it was all chaos. They had forms of social control. They had protocol, they had rules, they had responsibilities. They had measures for social control. Governance. They exercised this. Self-government. They exercised their sovereignty. Of course, they had their membership. They knew who their members were. Some people chafe at the use of the term citizen, but they knew who their citizens were. They knew, again, what the rights and responsibilities of those individual members happened to be. But they also had this important psychological dimension of maintaining their distinct identity, right? I mean, that's an attribute of nations, nationalism, a nation state. And to this day, if we didn't have that force, that psychological force, that desire, there probably wouldn't be many Inuit on the map. There are very few to begin with. But, you know, without that desire to maintain their distinct identity, their distinct status, their distinct rights and responsibilities, customs, practices, and institutions. So all this does, in fact, suggest economic, social, cultural, spiritual, and national unity. You know, if you meet indigenous peoples in the halls of the United Nations, they're going to often refer to themselves as either indigenous peoples, as a collectivity, or indigenous nations, peoples, and communities, which has become often the term. And in the earliest debates, as far as Francisco de Vitoria, Bartolome de las Casas, and a wide range of others, these are where the debates of where indigenous nations fit in the law of nations. Vitoria in particular is referred to often as the father of international law. Well, again, indigenous peoples, those that first encountered the law of nations, again, they have this sense of being a nation. And you know, those early debates were about the capacity of indigenous peoples. Do they have right reason? Do they, can you imagine those early debates of encounter and conquest? Nevertheless, and I'm not going to reiterate the history that you know of in terms of the plight of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and elsewhere, but this set of early debates, especially by Vitoria, focused on the intrinsic dignity of human beings, including indigenous peoples. And from this moment onward, as far as encounter and doctrines of discovery and conquest and so forth, this is really what the struggle for indigenous peoples has been about, is basic dignity in terms of the development and the evolution of international law. And we know that there are huge chunks of swaths of history that I'm going to leap over here. But you can see in various different sets of jurisprudence in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, how law was utilized in order to exploit, dominate, and subjugate. And it's always been about the gold, right? It's always been about the resources. Even if we look at what's going on here and now with regard to the Arctic, if we look at what's going on in Greenland, it's about uranium, it's about minerals, rare earth minerals, it's about oil, it's about gas. Well then, in those earliest encounters, you know, it's always been about the resources. But the borrowing of law and the use of law, I think in many cases can be illustrated, at least for those who study federal Indian law in the United States, the Marshall trilogy of cases where they try to legitimize their various different doctrines. The doctrine of discovery itself, the notion of domestic dependent nations that, okay, we, through just war, and through the law of war, we did legitimately conquer your people and thereby take the land and utilize it to serve their own purposes, their own nationalist purposes, their own economic agendas, their own purposes. And of course, the final Marshall trilogy of cases, once they figured out how to use the law to legitimize control over indigenous peoples, affirming the federal authority and ensuring that through their jurisprudence that in the United States at least, Congress has plenary power over Indian people, that they can do to Indian people whatever they want to do. Now, these policies, I cite them in large part because they've been exported outside the United States and borrowed by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a wide range of other countries across the globe. Well, the attempts to alter this against the backdrop of indigenous peoples, indigenous collectivities, indigenous groups, indigenous nations, was to pry open the doors of this international system to reinsert themselves into the law of nations as legitimate subjects and objects of international law. And some of the first efforts were on the part of Descahe, a Haudenosaunee faith keeper who attempted to pry open the doors of the League of Nations in order to say, hold on, there's a problem, we've got some abrogation of basic treaty rights here, and we ourselves can represent ourselves through our own voices, not those of others. Unfortunately, the League of Nations didn't swing the doors wide open to Desgahe. Some of you may know that a Maori chief, in relation to abrogation of treaty rights under the Treaty of Waitangi, attempted to do the same and pry the doors open of the League of Nations and assert that they were in fact nations, that they, again, had all of these attributes that we understand that attach to nation states to this day. And again, I'm going to leap over huge chunks of history by indicating that largely the movement of indigenous peoples at the international level, and in particular through the United Nations, has always been about safeguarding that intrinsic dignity of indigenous human beings, of indigenous peoples, both as individuals and as collectivities. As many of you may know, the United Nations has in fact responded. It took quite a lot of advocacy for them to ultimately respond. There were a range of different important pivotal moments in the history of the United Nations, namely an important study that's often referred to as the Martinez-Cobo study, because he happened to be the special rapporteur appointed by the United Nations to look at the status and conditions of indigenous peoples across the globe. His voluminous study recommended, even before it was completed, that the United Nations ought to begin the drafting of a universal declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. Again, going back to that intrinsic dignity of indigenous peoples. And that recommendation prompted the United Nations to establish a working group to do exactly that, prepare a declaration concerning the rights of indigenous people. How many people in the room have read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Raise your hands high. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, so comparable to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you think about the distinct cultural context of indigenous peoples, that ultimately the goal was to prepare, again, a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. So roughly from 1982 until 2007, this consumed the energy and resources of indigenous peoples across the globe. Fortunately, in September 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I myself believe that this document is fairly comprehensive and does, in large part, respond to the desire of indigenous peoples. Now, of course, we have this huge problem of the settler colonial regime that we haven't had an opportunity to effectively budge or dismantle, but nevertheless, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides us with some important tools to hopefully begin to push back. However, the government of Canada, they're not very friendly towards indigenous peoples. They're not very friendly towards First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Not long ago, meaning last week, and some of you may have heard about this in the CBC News or elsewhere, following the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which contains the minimum standards necessary for the survival of indigenous peoples across the globe, there was a high-level plenary meeting at the United Nations on September 22nd and 23rd, followed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's Climate Change Summit. Maybe some of you heard about this big event. The main effort was to compel states to implement the standards contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And after some hasty negotiation, they came out with an outcome document that makes very important commitments on the part of nation states, member states of the United Nations, to begin implementing the standards of the Declaration. Once it was adopted by consensus, the Vice President of the Assembly asked if there were any explanations of vote. The only government that spoke up was Canada. Well, the Holy See did have a problem with sexual and reproductive health, but more significantly to me was the fact that the government of Canada spoke up and wanted to express their concerns about the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent and their interpretation of it. And this is a very dark mark on what was supposed to be a jubilant moment within the halls of the United Nations. At any rate, I think that as far as the various First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Canada, immediately after their taking of the floor for an explanation of vote, later that afternoon, probably about 25 or 30 of them corralled the deputy ministers and started to apply some pressure upon them. Again, going right back to recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples as peoples, the recognition and respect for their individual and their collective rights. This dynamic of trying to compel nation states with the use of the law of nations to uphold their international legal obligations continues. And the law of nations is being utilized as a tool through the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and elsewhere, and through jurisprudence. I mean, even your home court here, the Canadian Supreme Court, the jurisprudence, the recent Chilcotin case on free, prior, and informed consent set a standard that the Canadian government is in direct contradiction with at the international level. So we're doing what we can as far as the use of law, international law, but as well domestic and national law. For those that are interested, I would point you in the direction of the work of the International Law Association and its first Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the recently formed one, the Committee on the Implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, I kind of parachuted into this event, and I know that one of our colleagues here flew across the country to join you this evening, so I'll stop there and hope that what I've shared with you in these brief comments has been useful and constructive. Even if you just take a snippet, like the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Google it and read it, as well as maybe some of the other points that I've made. Kuyana Swak, thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me all the way from Los Angeles. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think the work you're doing is nothing short of sacred. So congratulations, and be strong. I'm going to talk about two things: settler colonialism in general, both the phenomenon and the field of study, and then how Palestine-Israel fits, indeed should be understood within this context. So let me first go to compare settler colonialism in general. European expansion from the 16th century onward produced two related but clearly distinguishable forms of colonialism. One was metropole colonialism, in which European powers conquered and ruled vast territories without the immigration of Europeans seeking to make these territories their national home. British India is a good example of this form of colonialism. The other type was settler colonialism, in which conquest brought with it substantial waves of European settlers who, with the passage of time, sought to make the colony their national patrimony and ended up producing or creating European nation states or nation states in the European mold and capitalist economies. The US and Australia are prime examples, of course, but there are many others, including where we are now. This process entailed a relationship with the indigenous people that could range from dispossession to elimination, or from slavery, which for the most part did not use native population, to cheap labor, depending on the economic and social formation of the given settler society. Power relations within the triangle comprising metropole, indigenous people, settlers, have yielded one of three outcomes. One, the settlers managed to gain independence from the metropole and establish a nation state with dire consequences for the indigenous people. Again, the US, Australia, Canada, and Israel, for example. There are more. The settlers could not prevail and eventually had to leave, as happened in French Algeria and British Kenya. Or three, the settlers won independence, but with the passage of time were unable to prevent indigenous reassertion, as in South Africa and Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. For a long time, colonialism tended to be associated exclusively with the first form, at least in the 20th century, namely metropole colonialism. The systematic and especially comparative examination of settler colonialism as a historically and analytically discrete phenomenon is relatively recent. This implies neither that all settler societies are identical, nor that their historically distinct trajectories should be discarded, but rather that they are comparable and that the comparison adds invaluable insight to the study of these societies by showing that they cohere into a global phenomenon. The achievements of the comparative study of settler colonialism have been at once scholarly and political. Several of these colonies gave birth to powerful nation-states which have asserted their own hegemonic narrative, both nationally and internationally. The comparative field not only questions these narratives through countervailing evidence and interpretation, but also offers an alternative account of the social formations themselves. In the process, three fundamental features common to those hegemonic settler accounts are undermined. The first of these is the putative uniqueness of each settler nation. The second is their privileging of the settlers' intentions, I should say, as sovereign subjects at the expense of the consequences, be what may the intentions, and at the expense of the natives' subjectivity. Third is the supposed inconsequence of the natives or the indigenous people to the form each settler society takes. In other words, the conflict with the indigenous people is not denied, but the fundamental role that this conflict has played in shaping the identity of the settler nation is written off. Comparative settler colonialism is a sine qua non for a proper understanding of not only the past, but also the present perfect. Here, the work of the Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe has been pivotal. The originality and insight of Wolfe's writings on this issue lies in his appreciative critique of anti-colonial writers like Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon, and later ones like Gayatri Spivak. For all the homage paid to heterogeneity and difference, Wolfe observes, the bulk of post-colonial theorizing is disabled by an oddly monolithic and surprisingly unexamined notion of colonialism. One of the reasons for this, he argues, I quote him, consists in the historical accident, or is it, that the native founders of the post-colonial canon came from franchise or dependent as opposed to settler or Creole colonies. This gave these guerrilla theoreticians the advantage of speaking to an oppressed majority on whose labor a colonizing minority was vulnerably dependent. But what if the colonizers are not dependent on native labor? Indeed, what if the natives themselves have been reduced to a small minority whose survival can hardly be seen to furnish the colonizing society with more than a remission from ideological embarrassment, unquote. Woolf attributes decisive explanatory significance to the fact that, in contrast to the colonial formation that Cabral or Fanon confronted, settler colonies were not primarily established to extract surplus value from indigenous labor. Rather, they were premised on displacing indigenes from or replacing them from the land. This created a situation in which it was difficult to speak of an articulation between colonizer and native, since the determinate articulation is not to a society, but directly to the land, a precondition of social organization. The bottom line is a formulation that other scholars of settler colonialism understandably cite. I quote Patrick Wolf again. Settler colonies are premised on the elimination of the native societies. The split tensing reflects a determinate feature of settler colonization. The settlers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. So, now to Palestine-Israel. Since we have created the general framework. Let me start with a general and crudely put observation, which is really the bottom line, and then work my way to it and explain what this means in a deeply historical way. So the crudely put statement I want to make is that what bothers the Israelis about the Palestinians until this very day is not their alleged terrorism, however you want to define it, nor cultural differences, nor religious differences. It's their mere presence. That's what bothers, fundamentally and thoroughly until this very day. And the search is for search to render this presence either non-existent, and since this is not completely possible, at least meaningless. Now let me work my way back to this crudely put statement and explain how I get there. Let me start with two different types of settler colonies in the general taxonomy of settler colonies, which I won't go into today. But they are two very basic and important types throughout settler colonialism and certainly for the history of Israel-Palestine. These two types are, one is called the plantation colony, and the other one is called the pure settlement colony. In the plantation colony, the settlers, I'm looking at it from the settlers' perspective because I'm talking about settler colonialism from the settlers' point of view. From their point of view, in the plantation colony, what the settlers want is both the land, obviously, and cheap indigenous labor. French Algeria is an outstanding example. South Africa, not always, but from apartheid onwards, is another example. The second settler colony, which is absolutely pivotal, and this is what Wolf is really talking about, is the pure settlement colony. In that land-labor formation, the settlers want only the land. They not only do not want indigenous labor, they eschew it ideologically. In that formation, the indigenous people, from a settler's perspective, are superfluous. So before we start talking about racism, we have to talk about the material formation, in which labor is not wanted and even ideologically rejected. Land is all they want, but they want all of it. Again, the indigenous people become, in that formation, superfluous. The examples for this are the northern side of the American continent, with the south of the United States being a bit tricky, but I won't go into it, but certainly the northern part of the United States, and certainly Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel-Palestine. And now I go into Israel-Palestine. How and when did this occur? Well, at the beginning of the Zionist settlement in Palestine, between 1882 in 1904, roughly, or 4 or 5, what in Zionist parlance is called the first aliyah, or the first wave of immigration. The prevailing formation was plantation. What Gershon Shafir, who wrote a very important book on this, perhaps the most important book on this, called Ethnic Plantation. In this formation, which was imported from French Algeria through the experts of the Baron Rothschild, and the economy, the early economy, Zionist economy, was based on plantation that planted vineyards and produced wine. In that formation, Arab cheap labor, to call a spade, was essential. It would not have existed without it. But from 1904, roughly 1904, 1905, until the outbreak of the First World War, come what is called the second aliyah, or the second wave of immigration, of a completely different type of people who are not married, who are younger, who don't have families, and they seek employment and labor, and they have an ideology of the conquest of labor. The plantation people don't want to employ them because their salaries are much higher, their needs are much higher, and they would make the whole thing unprofitable. Secondly, they can't compete with indigenous labor because they are not as skilled. So they begin, through also the Zionist organization, I'm not going in details into this process, they begin the war for the conquest of labor and then for the conquest of land, whereby what they try to do is establish a labor market from which the Palestinians are excluded, which is settlers only, and a land market from which, again, the Palestinians are excluded. Remember, it's first under Ottoman rule and then under British rule, so they can't do completely what they want. This is the foundation of the pure settlement colony structure in Israel-Palestine, which in my view continue to evolve, but remember its structure, it's not an event, prevails until today. And to make a quantum leap, the idea of partition and of two-state solution, at least from the Israeli Zionist side, is precisely a continuation of the pure settlement colony formation, in which what is wanted is the land, but not the labor. So, the pure settlement colony is what defines Palestine, and in that, or Palestine-Israel, I should say, and within that structure, again, the indigenous population is superfluous, and this has not changed. The second point I want to make is the Nakba of 1948. And explain it, I hope, once and for all, because there's so much, obviously, talk about it, and it's so mobilized as an ideological tool that it needs to be explained. The dispossession of Palestinians from the land did not start in 1948. It started right from the Zionist colonization of Palestine through a capitalist legal system, and especially with the British mandate, which was a capitalist legal system since 1917, and with what the previous speaker defined, or I'm using a term that John Komaroff coined, through lawfare, through a capitalist definition of private property, and through lawfare. It's a very interesting episode, or a very interesting process, which I can't explain in details. The turning point that the Nakba introduced, or 1948, is not that settlers need to dispossess the indigenous people in order to carve for themselves a national patrimony, but that a settler state was established. This added to the lawfare, which continued to be exercised, legal violence or state violence. First to the War of 48, and then through the years of statehood. So, in that sense, it has to be made clear that 48 is indeed, I think, a turning point, but it has to be defined exactly in what sense. Dispossession and cleansing of Palestinians did not begin in 1948. it, of course, was exacerbated and accelerated because now there was a state with army, with a legal system, with lawyers, and so on and so forth. In the Q&A, if you want to ask more about this, I will certainly be more than willing to talk about it. And finally, the last point within this short presentation. What is then, I said that comparative settler colonialism insists that cases are comparable, but that they are not identical. And the specific historical trajectories should be respected. So what is unique, or not what is unique, but what is the specific trajectory of Israel-Palestine which sets it apart from other settler colonial cases? Well, there are several. First of all, I will say, the first one I'll mention is the Holocaust. No settler group or community that emigrated and settled and dispossessed the indigenous people in any other part of the world was in the danger of physical extinction as the Jewish settlers have been as a result of the Nazi genocide, or Nazi attempted genocide, but which was carried out substantially. So this is one thing that I think quantity and extent and measure do create a qualitative difference. I mean, it's one thing to be a Puritan and be persecuted in England in the 17th century, which I'm not belittling, but it's another thing to be subjected to a genocide with a Ford-like production line. This is one thing. The second thing is that if we look at it coldly, not with ethical and emotional consideration, but coldly, the Zionist project of settler colonialism is out of sync, or was out of sync. What do I mean by was out of sync? It used a method or a formation since the mid-1900s of pure settlement colony that had been practiced much earlier. Now, this formation results in elimination, but for several reasons, that elimination could not be carried out in Israel-Palestine, because I'll use a term that you will murder me for, I know, but I'll use it anyway because I'm not very concerned about PC. In fact, I dislike it. Because the indigenous population of Palestine, I call it more, in these languages I know, problematic, more developed, more organized, more structured, and therefore produced a much stronger resistance. Also, it had its hinterland that didn't bring them very far, that hinterland, but that's another story, of the Arab Muslim Middle East. Secondly, with all the horrors that settler colonialism involves, and I'm well aware of it, what you could do, you settler, in the 17th and 18th centuries and even 19th centuries, you could not do in 48 and after. So although the Israeli Zionist settler project dispossessed the Palestinians, it could not effect, also because of the lack of sync temporally, what the American and Australian settlers had effected earlier. You simply could not do a genocide of indigenous population, to call a spade, in the second half of the 20th century as you could earlier. And now I'm coming to again, I'm saying this to make the analysis very cold and realistic, and I'm well aware of the moral implications of all this. Now, to come closer to the present, what is still unique about Israel-Palestine as a settler colonial case, which is still going on? It's the fact, again, that is related to what I said earlier, that the indigenous people can still lay claim to sovereignty over the territory, which is not true, in my view, however painful it is, and it is painful, of any other indigenous community in any other settler society, and in any other settler nation that has been successful, not South Africa or Zimbabwe, which thank goodness fell apart, or Algeria and British Kenya, but those who succeeded in creating nation states. The First Nations here, the Native Americans in the United States, show resistance. The Maoris in New Zealand, the Aboriginals in Australia, show resistance, try to assert their identity, yes, but no one in his or her right mind, painful though it is, could say that they can compete with the settlers' notion of sovereignty. They do not compete over the sovereignty over even part, substantial part of their respective territories. The Palestinians do. And it's still viable in one form or another. Whether the final arrangement will be, I don't know what. 2 states, 1 state, common state, binational state, I don't know. Their claim to sovereignty is significant, politically significant. This sets this case apart, and it creates, in my view, the volatile situation that is Israel-Palestine. Why? Because basically the settlers won, but they didn't win enough. In other words, they won. The asymmetry of power between settlers and indigenous people keeps growing. But the settlers, i.e. the Zionist Israelis, cannot translate that asymmetry of power into final victory. In other words, they can't get rid of the Palestinians. Their presence is still there. They stay put. One way or another, they are being cordoned into small Bantustans and so on and so forth, and fragmented and weakened, there is no question. But this frustration of growing power exponentially, the relative power, and the inability to translate it into a final victory from a settler point of view is something that is what making the settler state increasingly frustrated and increasingly violent. And the final thing I want to say, there are all the time talks about the legitimacy of the state of Israel. My problem as an anti-Zionist Israeli with the state of Israel is not its legitimacy because of its origins, of which I am very well aware, more than, I believe, 99% of the population. But Israel, in that sense, in the circumstances of its coming into being, it's not more, but also not less legitimate than Canada, USA, Australia, Argentina, New Zealand, and so on. In that sense, it's futile, in my view, to contest its legitimacy on the basis of its origins. I think the problem of its legitimacy as what it is stems from the present, not from the origins. From that continuing oppression and operation like a settler state in which the indigenous people are increasingly being basically in the danger of elimination. It's that is the problem. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Good evening. Can you hear me? Yeah. I feel very privileged to be here after you've laid such sophisticated groundwork for what I'm going to talk about, which I think is trying to take some of these concepts and bring them to a more local focus. I want to thank the organizers, first of all, for inviting me to be here. I was a little bit skeptical because I told them that I didn't want to talk about my academic work. So, and that is because, for the most part, my activism with solidarity movements and organizing has been with local social movements. So what I'm going to talk about today is that very practical work in the local context. And I'm going to bring the conversation around settler colonialism to the context of what's been happening locally in Toronto and in Ontario and in Canadian politics. And I want to give a few examples of that and talk specifically about activist practice. And I'm going to situate that with my own work as a member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, which is a social movement group that's been organizing for about 6 years in the Toronto region, working to do solidarity work. And so what I mean by solidarity work is working collectively across difference with a goal in mind, right? And then developing particular strategies and tactics to reach those goals. So what I want to do is give you a couple of examples from current politics that I think outline some of these contemporary manifestations of settler colonialism as we see them in our government. And to give you a sort of sketch about what it is that QUIA in particular has been mobilizing against. And in doing so, I want to talk about two terms. One of them is this idea of neoliberalism and the challenges that it poses for social movement organizing. And the second thing is this idea of pinkwashing. And what exactly is that, and how is that a tactic used along with things like gay imperialism or homo nationalism? I realize for some of you these may be new words, so I'm going to stick to a few of them very specifically. And if we have more conversation about that afterwards, then that'll be great. Okay, so I want to go, first of all, how many people know what is QUIA or have heard about it before? Put up your hand if you've heard of QUIA. So a few people. For those of you who haven't, QUIA stands for Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. It was a group that formed in Toronto around 2008. Most of the people in the group were activists, cultural workers. Myself, I've been working for 20 years in the context of Palestinian solidarity organizing, mainly using sort of creative strategies to do education work around things like BDS and other issues. So the group really coalesced around this thing that happened in 2008 called Brand Israel, which was a marketing campaign put out originally by the State of Israel using gay rights as a way to distract the being able to look more clearly and analytically at some of the tactics of state violence that were being used against Palestinians. Okay, so this is this thing that I'm going to talk about in a minute as pinkwashing. Before I get to that, I want to talk about two kind of political moments that happened in the last 10 days that I think really exemplify this issue of neoliberalism that movements like QUIA are working against. So one of the things that QUIA was doing is marching as a group with its messaging in the Pride Parade in Toronto. This came to a head in 2009 when, I mean, we're all familiar probably with Rob Ford, who decided that if QUIA marched in the parade, he was going to withdraw funding from Pride Toronto. Okay, so this caused a kind of a crisis in the queer community around, were we going to stand up for freedom of speech and anti-censorship and support this group, or were we going to cave in to sort of this pressure by the mayor to push this group out? So that's kind of the context within which QUIA was working. So this has been coming up recently, still, in government circles. I want to talk first of all about the kind of broader political context. Last week, some of you might have seen this video of Thomas Mulcair and questioning in question period in the House one of the Conservative members. His name is Paul Calandra. He's actually the parliamentary secretary to the PM. Asking him about Canadian involvement in Iraq. Okay, how many people saw this video? You all know what I'm talking about. Okay, good. So this is what, in response to Mulcair's ask to the plan for Canadian troops in Iraq, this is what Paul Calandra says. He says, there's a great deal of confusion with respect to the NDP position on Israel. I wonder if the leader of the opposition can confirm for me whether Alex Anderson, who
who identifies himself as a fundraiser, if he speaks for the NDP when he says, "Fuck the IDF and all who supports them. I'm sick and tired of the media BS trying to sell lies and hide a fucking genocide." Does, Calandra asks, Anderson speak for the NDP when he says these shameful things? So Wpirg is kind of like, doesn't really know what's going on because he asked about Iraq, and this is the answer he gets, right? So he tries again, and then Calandra continues. "Our friends in Israel are on the front lines of combating terrorism, Mr. Speaker. So when people who work for the NDP calls what the IDF are doing a fucking genocide and calls the media BS for not supporting this view, what does Mulcair not understand? Israel is on the front lines, will continue to support our friends in Israel, and Canada will stand up for peace and security around the world." That's what he said. A few days later, we know Calandra gives this tearful apology in the House of Commons. He says, "I'm sorry, I was inappropriate. I didn't address the question." And he cries, and everyone gives him a standing ovation. This is neoliberalism. This is what I'm talking about, and I want to pick it apart a little bit. It's a performance, right? And it illustrates the challenges for political organizing in neoliberal times. This is what we're up against. Canada is positioned as a friend of Israel, which is also metonymically positioned as standing along with Canada for so-called peace and security around the world. Okay, so to question the role of the IDF as acting as the military or domestic arm of state violence, in some ways, I mean, we've talked a little bit about sovereignty already, but I want to extend that definition for sovereignty around Mbembe's idea of the right to decide who lives or dies. So really, the very question of who counts as human, right? So what we're talking about here is that kind of analysis is being elided or glossed over in this favor of this view as Israel as being a benevolent actor for peace, with Alex Anderson a seeming traitor to the cause, okay? And that's what I would say, I don't know what you would call that, maybe not pinkwashing or whitewashing, or there's some kind of glossing over propaganda going on there. It's a familiar rhetoric started long ago with George Bush. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists, okay? This is what Derek Gregory might call the everywhere war. Okay? So that's the first example. A second example was last week. We have a mayoral race going on in Toronto that some of you may be aware of. John Tory, one of the Conservative candidates, was at a fundraiser for the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, and he made the statement that the Pride organization should be defunded. This is what one of his election platforms, if Quia chooses to march in the parade. So for those of us in Quia, it's sort of like, okay, again, we already went through this like 3 years ago. The city manager put together a report stating that Israeli apartheid, the phrase itself is not hate speech. It doesn't contravene any of the city's human rights codes. But John Tory didn't care about this, right? What he wants to do is now push this neoliberal agenda, where instead of looking at the underlying issues of what Quia represents, he wants to sort of make a statement like, we don't want those political people here. We want gay people to be all about sexuality and having fun and celebrating, not having a political analysis about something that's going on. We think it doesn't have to do with our local politics. So this is what he had to say about it. I believe, he stated, the city should have found an organization like that, with the sort of rhetoric and whatnot that it puts forward, is not consistent with the city's human rights policy. I've marched many times in the Pride Parade, and it's a great celebration of human rights and a whole bunch of things. I frankly haven't seen him there, but I just don't think there's really any place for that kind of virulent kind of political. They should go have their demonstration somewhere else. Okay, so we're, Olivia Chow, who some of us want to feel good about, even though, she hasn't been that progressive on these issues, came out as saying what I'm going to call a neoliberal view in itself, that, well, we should be really concerned about freedom of expression. That's the heart of our values. That's what democracy is about. So for me, I have two kinds of problems here. One is that radical political organizing has to be then domesticated under this framework of modernity as a sovereign. Like, is it possible actually to talk about solidarity organizing outside of what we think of as modernity? What would that look like? I mean, I don't have the answer for you with this, but as an academic, these are the questions I'm asking. As an activist, these are the practices I'm trying to live out in the social movement organizing that I do. They're very difficult questions because they ask us to look at ourselves and our identity politics and our investments and look towards some of these failures. We have these frameworks available to us, the legal system, international law, the very concept of sovereignty itself. How helpful are those frameworks in thinking through some of these very particular dynamics that come up when we're talking about the issue of genocide? The very status of what it means to be able to call oneself human, right? To have even access to those rights. So, we're not the first ones to talk about this. People have been talking about it for many years. Judith Butler started in the early 2000s as an academic, talking on campuses about these issues, about Israeli apartheid. But I want to give you sort of two contemporary examples, and I had some slides. Would you be able to, what do I do? I don't know if you want to turn down the lights a bit so we can see these images a bit. I'm not going to take too much more of your time, but maybe this will take us into the conversation period where people can ask more questions. So I want to talk about this term pinkwashing. I'm wearing our one of the Kwaya pinkwashing shirts. I have some other Kwaya swag over here too. People hand it out over Pride Parade if anybody wants some condoms. So it's not just about Saturday.
I'm sure that I got one.
He got one.
I'm so old that I hope I'm lucky enough to use it.
That's not cool. Okay, so I encourage all of you to go to Pinkwashing Israel, this site. It's a great web network that has been built mainly by queer Palestinians and queer folks living in the Middle East to inform folks in the West about what these issues are all about. So this is their definition. To use gay rights as a way to gloss over, distract from, and normalize the settler colonial and apartheid reality that the State of Israel has established on the ground. Pinkwashing is meant to cover up these violations with a facade of progressiveness and equality. In short, Israel pinkwashing aims to isolate queer from other identities and make its record on gay rights trump its continued occupation and brutalization of the Palestinian people. It's quite a mouthful, so I wanted to give you some images, I think, that drive this point home a little in more of an obvious way. If I do this, is it going to work? Okay. This is an image put out by this organization called ethicaloil.org. It is a conservative NGO started built on, you know who Ezra Levant is? Some of you may know him as a very conservative Albertan who lobbies for the oil industry. So they put out these ads in 2011. They put out 7 very provocative ads. So most of the ads, what they do is they contrast what's seen as to be progressive. So it's a sort of branding, right, of oil as being so-called ethical by making these juxtapositions between the so-called democratic Canada and the other, which is usually depicted as a sort of terrorist other or aboriginal other. Although interestingly here, we have this kind of strange juxtaposition between, we're meant to think of the slide on the left as perhaps those are bodies of Indigenous peoples, whereas here in Canada, we have a smiling Aboriginal person who's employed by the oil sands. I'm not sure how many of you are going to buy into that particular marketing strategy, right? But this is, we might call this greenwashing. So related to that is this idea of pinkwashing here. Okay, so this image juxtaposes in the Middle East, what we're meant to believe here is that queers are persecuted, but in Canada, it's a gay mecca. Okay? So, what Quiet is trying to do, first of all, is say, hey, this is happening, and two, this is a problem. So it's not that we're like queer folks, like hanging out with other queer folks to be celebrating. It's like we're trying to talk to the queer community about being more political about the politics of the Middle East and the ways in which they can do that, right? And we're doing that in solidarity with queers around the world, but also in solidarity with Palestinians. So this is very tricky work. Like in ethical work, there's lots of questions that are raised around, how to have this kind of practice going on. Here's another example. This is actually produced by Blue Star, is a PR firm from the States, and I'm sure Gabriel can talk to like the lobby down there is pretty strong, as it is in Canada. But this is another example of pinkwashing, right? Where the idea is here that, well, Israel is a democratic country because we allow gay people into the military. So what we're suggesting is, or what I'm suggesting, I should use, this is my suggestion here, not just mine, it's backed up by other people who are interested in dismantling this idea of pinkwashing, is that this covers over, of course, a lot of the horrible state violence that is being perpetrated by Israel. And John Tory was also all talking about, like, well, we want Toronto, just like Tel Aviv, to be a gay mecca of the West. So this is the problem with this kind of propaganda. So I'm just going to end there on the slide that I didn't march with Quiet this year, but that was their wonderful banner that they had in the parade. And I think the map is the one similar to the one that you have on your poster for the presentation today. So I'm going to end there. So thanks very much. Thank you so much. I think that's going to give us a lot to think about, and I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, so I promise I will get to them very shortly. But I do want to start off with two questions of my own. So if we critique Israel as a settler state, but then do not link that critique back here where we live, does this mean that we fear unsettling the grounds at home? Is it a reflection of our desire to naturalize colonialism in North America? And perhaps, Dalee, I'd like to start with you on that, and feel free to contribute.
Well, I think that the distinction that Gabriel made with regard to the Americas and the issue of Palestine, I think that's an accurate distinction. And it's really kind of, I had a friend asked me, why didn't you guys put up more of a fight, why didn't you, we always hear the term stand your ground, why didn't you resist, why didn't you put up a fight? And where on earth is that coming from? If you think about the resistance that was put up, I mean, it was, genocide is very accurate. It's a very accurate term. Article 8 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples addresses the issue of genocide. It was genocide. Manifest destiny equals genocide. So the as far as here and now and overcoming some of these issues, as far as the reality of dispossession, the reality of exploitation, the reality of subjugation, the reality of genocide, of which nation states, I have to say, with regard to Article 8 in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, didn't want to attach the term genocide to indigenous peoples. It was, well, that's something that happened in the past. That's a, you know, that didn't happen in the context of indigenous people. So I think for here and now, again, the tools that indigenous peoples have at their fingertips, as far as resistance, as far as reclaiming, as far as, I mean, if you think about it, especially along the eastern seaboard, it's extraordinary that there are still indigenous peoples here. My husband is a member of the Waccamaw-Siouan tribe. There are only 1,800 of them on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, but they're still there. And so I think the distinction is accurate, but nevertheless, indigenous peoples have persisted and will continue to do so. And we know that pushback as far as the settler is concerned, the fight continues. I'm really fortunate that I come from an area where no one else wants to be. In terms of the Arctic, and you know, it's so geographically speaking, we're fortunate to some extent, and maybe that's a factor in all of this. But I think that there are the next generation and the next will pick up these tools and do what they can as far as the pushback is concerned.
No, I'm not. I don't even remember the question.
I think, does it work? Yes. Sorry. I think that both have to be done. In other words, the connections and the solidarity, the connections, but in intellectual terms, but also in terms of political alliances, have to be emphasized. But that shouldn't mean that the differences are elided or are glossed over or are made conveniently look the same. So to make it concrete, I mentioned earlier there was a panel in the UCLA Law School last week called From Gaza to Ferguson. Now, what was joined there is the instinctive and beyond instinctive, reflective also, recognition that in the framework of settler colonialism is what makes these things, first of all, comparative, but also identify the actual connections, and there are, both at the level of the oppressors and the level of the oppressed. But that doesn't mean that they are exactly the same. First of all, because the Palestinians are indigenous people. The African Americans are not indigenous people. They were people who were brought as slaves and so on. So the idea is to do both, which is very difficult. I absolutely agree. It's to emphasize the solidarity, the connections, the global dimension of it, but also not to fear differences when there are, and they should be. And the last thing I'm going to say, I've said it many times because I've been in many apartheid weeks, Israel apartheid weeks, and I keep repeating, I can understand why the apartheid slogan or image is used, because it's a good mobilizing, it has good mobilizing force, and there are certain similarities, but fundamentally the situations are different, to go back to what I said earlier, because I think the Israeli-Palestinian case is, believe it or not, worse. Precisely because of the material difference. In the South African formation, it could not have existed without indigenous labor. Therefore, even at the darkest times of apartheid, none of the apartheid formulators could imagine a South Africa that is clean, that is, that is black line. Because the blacks were needed for the continuation of the economic formation. This is not the case in Israel. They are not needed. There was exploitation of Palestinian labor here and there, but from the perspective of the settlers, if you, hypothetically, God forbid, remove all the Palestinians today from Palestine, all of them, Israeli citizens and occupied territories, the Israeli economy has no problem in continuing to function, maybe on the contrary. So that's a crucial difference that, to go back to apartheid should be used, comparisons should be made, but if we want to be honest and ethical and intellectually rigorous, we have to emphasize the differences as well.
I want to go back to this issue of comparisons between settlers, and Sarah, perhaps here you can shed some light on this. So, you know, in recent years we've seen a dramatic increase in settler violence in Israel, in cases of settler violence. And sometimes these stories even make the news here. Just recently, I believe it was today, that the Americans again are condemning the latest round of settler expansion in East Jerusalem, in so-called East Jerusalem. And yet I would argue that this portrayal of these violent settlers has been rendered through very much a disidentification with those settlers here at home, rather than a recognition of similar historical, political, and ongoing practices of settling in North America. So I'm wondering, Sarah, from your work, you know, the flip side of that, right, is what you've been talking about, is Israel's PR campaign, Brand Israel and pinkwashing, to encourage progressive Westerners' identification with Israel and that colonial project. So I'm wondering, from your experience, what the impact of this tension has been on public perceptions of Israel. Are people recognizing that these are two, you know, opposing approaches, or how has this impacted people's perceptions of Israel?
Well, I'm not sure I can really speak to, in any like rigorous way, to what people's public perceptions of Israel are, but I can certainly bring the issue back to, you know, problems and challenges for social movements practice and solidarity work. One of the things is that when John Tory says that if Kwaya marches in the Pride Parade, he's going to take away funding, that means that Kwaya's function as a social movements organization is kind of ended, because we've already been co-opted by the neoliberal modality. So there's no work left for us to do. So what does that have to do with public perception? It has to do with the public perception here and the permissibility to be able to be even able to engage in critique. So if one can't engage in critique as part of a so-called democracy, and I'm not suggesting that the democracy is the best way to do this, but even in the House of Commons, when we can't have a conversation like that, then what is the possibility for even being able to answer a question like this, when within our own political frameworks, we've disavowed that very ability to engage ourselves in social critique?
I just want to add to that. First of all, just to prevent confusion, you're talking about, I think I understand correctly, the settlers in the post-67 territories, not because we are all the time talking about settler colonialism as the whole project. And here I want to make an analogy to what Sarah said earlier. Pinning, and it's complicated, again, as your first question, I mean the answer, what to do is complicated, because pinning the blame for the whole thing on the settlers in the occupied territories is settlers washing like gay rights is pink washing. And I'll explain in what way. Because it's very easy for liberal Zionists, or even Netanyahu, to denounce the burning to death of the Palestinian youngster in East Jerusalem. Why not? Of course, it's illegal, they are terrible, it's not us, he abhors it, and so on and so forth. The problem with focusing on the settlers in the occupied territories, singling them out, occludes the fact that this is a state project and has been from the start. Even if we ignore everything I said earlier and look only on 67 onwards, it's isolating the settlers creates this, I mean, in a different way, of course, what Sarah called pink washing. because it says, well, we are okay, but it's these horrible settlers who hijacked everything from us, as if labor governments didn't do settlements, as if they didn't put the settlers there. It's a state project. Of course, their criminality should be denounced, criticized, and I'm not saying that this should not be done, but many, including some in the Israeli left, make the consistent mistake of saying the problem is the settlers, the rest is okay. So if we only get rid of the settlers, we are fine. But the settlers are not, they are the state, they are part of the state. It's a state project. The project of illegal settlement in the territories in the post-67 era could not have happened if the state had not wanted them to happen. So with all due respect to the settlers, and God knows they're quite culpable, but it's a mistake to single them out as the only problem. The rest is okay, it's the settlers.
All right, at this time we'll open it up for audience questions. So if you'd like to line up on, I think, on this side over here, we'll have a mic so that everybody will be able to hear you. You can go ahead and do that, yeah. We'll have a mic. And so I'll ask you to have several questions that you ask one at a time so that everybody has a chance.
Just a quick question or a comment. Just focusing on so-called settler violence, kind of like focusing on ISIS beheadings. I mean, we're forgetting the structural, kind of like the state violence done every day, the banal sort of violence done by the state on the ground or from the air. But I just want to comment on when you define like a successful, so-called successful ethnic cleansing or not. I mean, we're forgetting about the germs and the biology of it. You know, in the Americas, a lot of it was done, unfortunately, through biology and not really done through like a distinct butchering. But because there are historical events like, say, Byzantium to Constantinople to Istanbul, or Visigoths Spain to Moorish Spain to Christian Hispania. So concerning these events, can you please, three of you, define indigenous, define imperialism, define these terms like colonialism? Just because historical events, who is like a colonist and who is not? I mean, just wondering what each of you define these terms, if you can, the three terms. Thank you.
Yeah, well, is it a question for me? Well, I won't comment on ISIS right now. I mean, they're not. I don't like. I to put it mildly, I don't like it. But that's not. But let me say two things in general, because I can't give a class on colonialism in general, settler colonialism in particular. There have been many conquests and atrocities and removals and dispossession and disinheritance in history, and the tactics of saying, but there were other atrocities. So what? I mean, why does this? We are defining a specific phenomenon in time and place, which certainly occurred and was called colonialism and imperialism, which means conquest versus domination from a certain imperial center, but that is clearly shaped the modern world within Europe and without Europe since the 16th century on. It's true that there were other imperiums and other conquests and other changes of regime, and I could go into, of course I don't have time here, what the differences are between, I would say even something as harsh as the Mongol invasion and conquest of the Middle East, and the European conquest and settlement in the Americas. There is a substantial difference in the sense that the Mongols had not tried and certainly had not succeeded in disinheriting the people who lived there, whether they were indigenous from time immemorial or indigenous because they had lived there for 3 or 4 or 5 or even 100 years, depending on the community, the area, the place, and so on. This is precisely what happened in the Americas. Any conquest known to me, except for certain cases of the Roman Imperium, did not completely annihilate whole societies or disinherited others. And I think within the context of technology and the spread of capitalism, this gives it a certain uniqueness within and discreteness, and it is possible to identify it as such and analyze it as such for historians and others. Now, there is no point, that's what I'm trying to explain, in bringing on a litany of other cases of atrocities and massacres and so on. Of course there were, but the phenomena are different in kind, which doesn't make the previous or the other cases of butchering, genocide, invasion, conquest, atrocities, and so on, nicer, more palatable, or some that should be washed away or explained away. They're just different in terms of cold historical or any other, I'm a historian, but intellectual analysis from what you described. I think that's the gist of it.
Well, on this particular question and the use of the term colonialism and even the term indigenous peoples, from our point of view, we know who we are, right? You know, and there is no legal working, no hard and fast legal definition. There is a working definition that's very similar to what I described in terms of at the outset of my presentation, about the sense of nationalism, the shared language, and so forth. But the added dimension is the historical invasion, basically. This is as far as the working definition, the UN working definition, I should say, of indigenous peoples, because we do have situations, especially throughout Africa, throughout Asia, where UN member states quibble with whether or not there are indigenous peoples within their borders, and do they have international legal obligations vis-a-vis these indigenous peoples. Never mind, I mean, they're turning their backs away from the reality of colonization. Hence some of the language in the UN Declaration preamble. For example, affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals. And these were the debates of Victoria and de las Casas, is that we're somehow superior. On the basis of national origin, or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences, that these are racist and scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. This is one of the preambular paragraphs. So we're starting to get an idea of what colonialism is about, right? Later it says, concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of, inter alia, their colonization and dispossession of their lands, territories, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising, in particular, their right to development, any kind of development, economic, social, cultural, political, spiritual, in accordance with their own needs and interests. And so, again, we're kind of getting an idea of, in the context, the distinct cultural context of indigenous peoples, what these terms happen to mean. And as far as adopting any formal legal definition, there is some potential problem with including those who are not legitimately indigenous from the point of view of indigenous people like Inuit, Navajo, Maori, and others. But there's also the fear of excluding some that may in fact be legitimately indigenous. But just the question in terms of the usage of terminology, I just wanted to clarify in the context of indigenous peoples that I've worked with through the development of human rights standards. That there is an understanding. In fact, it's rare that it's actually verbalized to someone.
Is it working? All right. So for me, the last hour and a half have kind of been disappointing because I know the three of you are all teaching at universities, but you not only gave one side of this story and this conflict, there were lies in it. There were lies in your story. I mean, to call the Palestinians indigenous people is simply wrong. It's not true because the definition of indigenous people is the original people of the land. Now, there is a question. Okay. I'm addressing what you said.
No, if you can just ask your question as quickly as possible.
I have to-
have a lineup.
I have to address what was said.
No,
I think the
I
other
mean,
side of the story
okay,
should be
so
told as
thanks
well.
for playing, but you're not obeying the rules, okay? So the rule is you ask your question, and you're welcome to. If you want to talk about or address anything, you're welcome to stay after this, and then we'll be heading over to the grad house. So there is the time for you to address. Now, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
All right. So, given that the Jews in Israel were there since 3,000 years ago and have had a constant presence there for the last 3,000 years, how can you call the Palestinians, whose culture comes from the Arabic culture and the Muslim culture, both of which originate in the Arabian Peninsula, not in Palestine, how can they be the indigenous people there?
Thank you.
Well, talk about ignorance. I mean, if you think that some people who were defined in a problematic way, and at a certain point Judaism emerged out of them, that they are related to the same people who returned, as they call it, from 1882 onwards, and not the Jews who remained in Palestine in one way or another, then I'm not sure who is ignorant.
Okay, if you want to have the second question, you have to go to the back. Thank you. Next question, please.
So the main question is Dr. Piterberg, and I was just wondering. So I think you briefly mentioned the Ottoman Empire in the speech. The one thing I've always wondered about is it really fair to say that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire encouraged the immigration to Palestine? And if that is true, then the war policies pursued by the Ottoman Empire made the local population in the Arab world revolt against the Ottoman Empire.
First of all, the Zionist immigration to Palestine started under the Ottoman Empire. From 1882 to 1914, the Ottoman Empire, although it was severely weakened and was, as we know now, on the verge of disintegration and collapsed after the First World War, still existed and still ruled. And at the beginning, it had not objected to the Zionist immigration, and it thought, or at least the rulers in Istanbul, not everyone, thought that it could gain from the the Zionist settlement in Palestine. Not necessarily, although that too, the settlement in Palestine itself, but one of the things that Herzl was trying to do in order to get a formal charter from the Ottoman Empire was to help them alleviate the burden of a huge public debt. So they thought at some point, but then they retracted, that by creating some sort of agreement that Herzl was working on with the Zionist World Organization, perhaps they could, if not rid themselves, at least help substantially in ridding themselves. But I think that the turning point was, first of all, Sultan Abdul Hamid at some point changed his mind, and I won't go into it. It's clear. I mean, it's been written on, so it's not a mystery. But curtailed the possibility of Jewish immigration, and especially purchasing land. But the rules of the game changed completely when the British conquered Palestine and created a commitment to the Zionist, to the World Zionist Organization. So I think there was significant creation of a bridgehead. Under the Ottomans, they did not prevent it at all. But I think qualitatively and quantitatively, the game changed completely once the British took over with Allenby conquering Palestine.
Professor, could you please quickly go over the different aspects of colonialism? Because colonialism is not just going in by force and invading. There are many different aspects, changing the culture, changing all these different things about the people. And then one very quick thing. According to your definition of indigenous people, I wouldn't be Egyptian. I'm not Egyptian, okay? What you're saying, I wouldn't be Egyptian according to your definition of indigenous people. Because I'm not the same as the blood of the pharaohs doesn't run in me. I'm not the same as those Egyptians who built the pyramids.
I understand.
But I'm Egyptian, and they are Palestinian, and the land belongs to them.
Well, to go back to that, I mean, there's a degree to which I can't, obviously if I gave a course on colonialism, then...
They want you to come back.
Well, then I could assign readings and... no, because it also has, it has an historical element of continuity which was alluded to before by the first person who asked. It's impossible to understand post-16th century European expansion without investigating how they understood Greek, ancient Greek, I mean, and Roman colonization, imperium, and so on. So it's in that sense, it's a complicated question, but for our purposes, what I wanted to do so, precisely so as not to give a class on colonialism, is to define what is commonly understood, and I think rightly so, of the European expansion, mainly British, but other powers too. But with time, Britain eclipsed everyone, at least until the United States came into being and grew strong and so on, is the conquest of certain non-European territories which with time became most of the globe, for two sometimes related or interacting purposes, but basically different. One was to extract surplus and resources in order to enrich the colonial metropolitan center as such. This is what we call metropole colonialism, and that's what most people understood until recently, at least in the 20th century, as colonialism. But then there was the other phenomenon in which Europeans settled in territories peopled by non-European people, and with time dispossessed them, eliminated them, and carved for themselves, when they were successful, nation states with a capitalist economy. In certain cases, they failed to do so, but this is the second type, which is settler colonialism. So one is based on native labor mainly and extracts surplus resources, strategic assets, minerals, all sorts of things, and by doing so, completely transforms the place that it conquers. And the other one is settler colonialism, in which the colonizers, as Patrick Wolf says, come to stay. They don't go away. So if you want it in the form of classical, ancient, well, Greek ancient and Roman literature, colonialism, metropole colonialism, is Homer's story of Ulysses. He goes and he comes back. Just like Conrad's novel. Settler colonialism is Virgil's Aeneas, or Aeneid, not the person, but the creation, the piece. Aeneid goes from Troy and settles elsewhere, never to return. That is settler colonialism. Ulysses, who goes to Troy but returns to Ithaca, is colonialism or metropole colonialism.
And indigenous peoples unfortunately suffer from all of them. For example, Greenland, 56,000 people, they're the majority, they're on the possible path toward independence, and the 1933 Eastern Greenland case and the doctrine of terra nullius, that this is land belonging to no one. Yeah, exactly. Another doctrine, discovery, conquest, but terra nullius. But to be extremely elementary about it from and the use of the term in the context of indigenous peoples is domination, exploitation, and subjugation. And the use of law, in particular, to subsume indigenous peoples and to legitimize the domination, to legitimize the exploitation and subjugation, is at least the undercurrent that I've looked at, and now we're trying to reverse that current through, unfortunately, the use of many of their own laws and rules and policies, but in some cases they're effective. In some cases they are in fact useful and constructive.
I just want to ask a short question. So, Israel, for me, it doesn't represent a monolithic society. There are many fractions. And its treatment of Palestinians is also not monolithic. There's a difference between how Palestinians in mainland Israel is treated to the way it's treated in the West Bank and Gaza. So what I want to ask is, would it be correct to say that, okay, the way Palestinians might be treated in Gaza and West Bank might be like South Africa, but at least the way Palestinians are treated in mainland Israel is like 1970s Britain. They're constitutionally equal, but face racist discrimination every day. And in any negotiation in future, this possibly could be dealt with. And also, can you address those sections of Palestinian society, Israeli society, who want to get rid of occupation, who want a two-state solution, and who want genuinely a Jewish state respecting Arabs and vice versa? Thank you.
You want me to answer? First of all, there is obviously a legal difference that Israel has imposed because it has the power. I actually can go into details and will, but there is a basic difference. You're right in that sense. That those Palestinians who, in one way or another, remain within the boundaries of the State of Israel as it was not recognized, but as it was created in the armistice agreements of 1949, are citizens. They are second class citizens with limitations and recently, in recent years, attacks and on their very own and on their mere citizenship and their right to have it, that is increasing, not decreasing. So then I'll come back to them, but then there's the Palestinians in the occupied territories after 67 who don't have any status other than subject people with whom the occupier can do more or less what he wants. Now, I think the difference is that I will not even resort to the explanation of the settler state, although I think it is relevant, that in Britain there was immense racism against Pakistanis and Indians, and I'm not trying to portray the situation after, it's actually longer than the 70s. It began in the 50s when basically, to call a spade, Pakistanis were brought to reconstruct England as cheap labor after it had been destroyed, not destroyed, but damaged heavily in the Second World War. But on the whole, with problems and difficulties, there is progress in Britain, and I know Britain very well. I studied there, I lived there, I visited. There is growing integration. The people from South Asia are becoming more and more part of British society, more visible, more confident. Nothing is ideal, but there's a long way to go from the terrible Enoch Powell speech in '68, which is not directed only against Indians and Pakistanis, but others, shall we say, as well, to today. The problem in Israel, I think, is that it's going the other way. In other words, it's not only that it has not improved. For instance, Palestinian citizens, I'm not talking about in the occupied territories, cannot buy land. They are barred from most neighborhoods and community settlements within Israel itself through all sorts of mechanisms that I don't have the time to go into. Their mere rights and right to live as equal citizens is being questioned, which was not, before it was the more optimistic narrative of, okay, we are under siege, we have a minority, as they call them, citizens, but with time they will become part of the state, it will become more equal. Now it's not, now it's go away. We don't want you, basically. So their lands have been expropriated in the 70s, in the late 60s and 70s and 80s in the policy of Judaizing the Galilee, and now in the land of the Bedouins in the Negev, in the best settler colonial fashion. So there is a difference, it's a legal difference. If you ask me to put it very bluntly and crudely, it's better to be a Palestinian citizen of the State of Israel than to be a Palestinian in the occupied territories. There's no question about it. But having said that, the situation is getting worse, and they are not equal citizens, neither by law nor by practice. Now, you asked about those Israelis who want a two-state solution, want to get rid of the occupation. First of all, even if you look at the formal electoral level, which is not insufficient, even then you see a complete erosion in the percentage, in the number of seats that parties that accept the two-state solution have. Likud does not recognize a Palestinian state in its platform, and to say nothing of parties to the right of Likud. So even at this very formal level, which is almost meaningless, it's even those who say hypothetically that they want a two-state solution, which is not possible, on the ground is not possible. their numbers, their percentage in the electorate is diminishing by the day. So I don't know what that means to say those who want a two-state solution, in the sense that even when they had the majority, they were not able to implement it. So it exists, yeah. They also write in Haaretz every day. But Haaretz does not reflect Israeli society. It reflects maybe 10% Jewish Israeli society. Well, it's a wonderful newspaper. I read it every morning, and I think it's one of the best. But it does not reflect Israeli society as a whole.
So the next questions I'm going to ask in the interest of time, because we are running late, that you both ask, the first two of you standing in line, ask both of your questions, one following the other, and then we'll have the speakers address them, and we'll proceed like that. If you have any other questions, of course, there's the social at the Grand House after, which is the best opportunity to get those answered. Go ahead, please.
All right, so in response to my last question, you claimed that I was showing my ignorance, and then you proceeded to give me a non-answer to the question that showed your own ignorance.
Can you please ask your question?
I'd like him to answer the same question, really. But to claim... Sorry?
Ask your question and then...
Okay, but to say that the Jews are no longer culturally the same people that lived there 3,000 years ago is just a lie. That's not true. They are the same people. They are the same religion.
Sir, what is your question?
I'm asking the same question again, but I'd like to clarify that that's not a legitimate answer in response to what the other guy said over here.
Okay, I think you have been
clear. The current Egyptians are not the same people as the ancient Egyptians, because those people don't exist anymore.
Okay, thank you.
I said that there were literally not people who could be, I didn't say that they were culturally, although this is debatable too, and the 3,000 years is debatable too. It is true that Judaism appears...
It's not debatable, 3,000 years.
Look, you have bad manners. You have bad manners. You are ignorant. And you are accusing yourself.
You don't want to hear another side of the story. You don't want to hear another side of the story.
Okay, we'd just like to move on to the next question so that everybody can
providing another side of the story.
Makes space for another.
Not on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
First, I would like to thank you for coming this evening here. And my question is for Dalee. It's a bit off topic, but I think it's going to be simple to answer for her. So, what's the position of the Aboriginal people on oil drilling in the Arctic? Do they recognize the economic benefits in oil drilling, or are they completely opposite based upon environmental aspects? Thank you.
Well, I think it's very difficult to generalize in response to that particular question. There have been examples where purportedly principles of good governance decisions have been undertaken to allow for oil development activity. Alaska is a perfect example of that, where the indigenous peoples along the north slope of Alaska, really by virtue of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the creation of corporations, rather than the transfer of land to traditional governments. And this was a unilateral act of Congress that was imposed in order to settle land claims in Alaska. Nevertheless, the people on the north slope of Alaska, through the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, which is one of the 12 regional corporations that was created by the 1971 Land Claims Agreement, have successfully joint ventured with industry and are very, very active partners in terms of oil development. However, if you go just to the east of them, a community called Koptovik, near the Canadian border, they're in strong opposition to oil and gas development, and in particular offshore oil development. The reality is that they sustain themselves primarily off of the bowhead whale hunt, and so you can see that the potential for offshore oil and gas activity and the risk, the stakes are very high, and they're in strong opposition to it. So it's very hard to generalize, because if we look at the reality of the right of self-determination, the right of indigenous peoples to determine their own development and their own priorities for development, it depends. I think that there are certainly some extraordinary examples where, for example, mining activity has taken place with very low adverse impacts that have gone through what I would suggest to be pretty rigorous application of the principles of good governance in terms of transparency, access to information, inclusiveness in terms of decision making. So, I mean, if you have all the right standards put in place, and if you're really engaging in the context or within the framework of the right of self-determination, it really is up to the people's concern to decide those things. So it's very difficult to generalize and give you one single answer. I will say that at this moment in time, the Greenland government has failed. There's been a collapse of that government. I think that those people who are in opposition to the mining of uranium in particular are probably celebrating that fact. And unfortunately, the Premier of Greenland was utilizing public funds for personal purposes, and it triggered a new election a year and a half earlier than it would have, but this also puts this question of uranium mining back into limbo, and I won't be surprised if the type of social organizing, political organizing on the part of those that were in opposition to it will possibly overrule the 15 to 14 decision of the Greenland Parliament on the question of uranium mining. So sorry to get off track, but I thought it was topical in terms of you can read some of this in the Financial Times and other papers. I don't know if the Canadian press has made any offered any coverage on that.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience with us. Two questions, I'll package them together. You touched upon a very interesting question. I think this is the first time I hear it from someone, is the question of legitimacy. I mean, you brought it into light, the question of legitimacy of Israel. And I want to quote the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, someone that I don't admire much, but he said something very interesting recently, which I thought was really different. He said the question of Israel is, to question its legitimacy is a reasonable question because it's an occupying power. I'd like you to comment on it. The other question is, you said that the Zionist settler movement, colonial settler Zionist movement, is unique in the sense that it had attached to it the suffering of the Jews in Europe, the genocide against the Jews. But how do you contextualize that in the sense that it happened in the late 1930s, early 1940s, where the Zionist settler movement started long before? Thank you.
And can we just get the last question as well, and we'll answer these all together.
So I believe Dr. Piterberg was saying that Palestine among indigenous sovereignty struggles has like a unique tenability to it. So I'd like to open it to some of the other panelists, whether they see any other indigenous sovereignty movements as having their own tenability. For me, some areas of Western Canada and the recent successes they've had comes to mind. I don't know if there's others you'd like to discuss.
Shall I reply? Well, two very good questions. I think to call, I don't know whether he meant Israel with the territories it's occupying after 67, or Israel in general as a phenomenon. If it relates to the occupation of post-1967, then yeah, Israel should, in one way or another, it's an illegitimate occupation, which has been, for reasons we could talk a lot about, has been allowed to exist for more than 40 years. There's no question. If it is about Israel as a settler colonial state within the comparative framework of other settler states all over the globe, then I would insist that Israel is not more and not less legitimate. In other words, if you question, now, what is the internal nature, the definition of Israel, whether its Zionist nature could be unpacked and it could become a state for all its citizens equally, that is a different question, and that is clearly where I think it should go. In other words, it should de-Zionize itself. That's the problem. In other words, that the initial brutal settler stage still persists, still continues, and there is no even a universal pretension to rectify it. That's the problem. I think that the problem of origins and process is not a reason to define it. It is painful, and it's painful for the indigenous people. But if you define on that basis Israel as illegitimate, I don't think it's more illegitimate than the United States or Canada or Australia. Why? Because it's the Holy Land and everyone looks at it and so on and so forth. It's not. Even someone who was a dear friend, the late Edward Said, insisted that whatever the solution is not to dismantle Israel by sending the Jews away and starting from scratch. The solution is to take everyone who is already there and create something more just and more sustainable and less oppressive than what exists. I don't think the solution is to delegitimize Israel as such. To delegitimize it for what it is doing and for its current structure is perfectly, I do this all I did it today. But to say that it's illegitimate because it is a result of a settler process, well, we are sitting in a state that is the result of a settler process. So what are you going to dismantle it now? No, you're going to create, hopefully, that's the struggle, a more equitable, a more tolerable, a more just place. That's my view on the question of legitimacy. Now, the question of the Holocaust, I didn't have, perhaps because I didn't have enough time to develop this, I think, I'm not saying you misunderstood me, I didn't have time to explain properly. I am not suggesting for a second that the natural and logical outcome of the Holocaust, whether morally or politically, is the state of Israel. If I said that, I would be a Zionist, which I'm not. To this I object completely. I think the lesson from the Holocaust, the right way to contextualize the Holocaust and look at it the way, in my view, it should be looked, is that you fight racism, genocide, and fascism by fighting racism, genocide, and fascism, not by replicating them elsewhere. That's, to me, to make sure that no society in which not only Jews but also Jews live becomes a state that exterminates and takes out a group of people out of the human race, tries to exterminate them, creates an oppressive totalitarian state, and so on and so forth. That's the way to learn a lesson from it and to fight it. Not to create another state that, I'm not saying I hate this comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany. I think it's the most idiotic, also for political and tactical purposes, thing to do, but also for real, for reasons of truthfulness. But what I did say is that not only the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism, or the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 19th century and the 20th century, and its explosion created pressure on groups that would be settlers in Palestine of a magnitude that had not existed in the creation of any other settler society. In other words, if you look at the population pressures, and that's debatable too, and economic pressures and social and so on, of Britain in the 19th century that drove many British to Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and Canada, you cannot, I'm not talking about the beginning even, you cannot compare them to the pressure that was put on people for whom one of the solutions, whether we agree with them or not, was to create a nation state elsewhere. So, first, to conclude or to summarize this, I'm not suggesting that the result of the Holocaust or the logical outcome or conclusion is the state of Israel. On the contrary, my conclusion is that you have to fight fascism and racism and so on, wherever it is, by whoever it is done, it doesn't matter. But what I am saying is that the groups of Jews who emigrated to Palestine with increasing numbers from, i.e. from Central Europe and especially Eastern Europe, which is where most of the Zionist immigrants came until the 1950s, the pressure in Europe on them was existential. And one of the conclusions they drew, or the solutions they sought, was to create a nation state. In their eyes, returning to the, as you heard here, returning to the land of their forefathers that was promised by God in the Bible 3,000 years ago, and so on. In that sense, the Holocaust, plus it was a political factor in pushing Western powers to allow and give legitimacy to the state of Israel. In that sense, it is an event that has no parallel in the history of other settler societies.
Well, as an indigenous person that lives in the United States, I'm going with delegitimize and dismantle. Just kidding. The question about the viability of indigenous peoples exercising, from their point of view and their perspective, the opportunity to maintain their territory, to hold and maintain their territory, their traditional territory, their cultures, customs, practices, languages, and so forth, either in Western Canada or elsewhere. I think that there is an opportunity. If we even look at, though it took at least 27 years for the Labrador land claim agreement to become realized for the Labrador Inuit, if you look at the provisions of that agreement, it's extraordinary that they were able to sit down at the table representing themselves in dialogue with the Crown, the government of Canada, as well as the province, and work out a land claim agreement that affirms their right to huge territory, and I think it's like 170,000 square kilometers of land, as well as access to lands adjacent, to have a specific provision that assures their right
to self-determination, their right to self-government, indigenous self-government, not like Nunavut, which is public government, but in Labrador it's indigenous specific. To affirm their rights to hunting, fishing, trapping, and their traditional economy, as well as, and this is even more stunning to me, to affirm their right to the 12-mile territorial sea as recognized in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That's extraordinary. And so I think there is some viability and tenability to the realization for indigenous peoples through law and politics to secure their territory and secure their future. Now, it's going to take them time to figure it all out. We shouldn't be measuring their success anytime soon, but nevertheless, I think this is quite extraordinary. And the only other, I know there are quite a few unsettled claims elsewhere, especially throughout Western Canada, a lot of litigation that we never hear about. But many of these indigenous peoples are not only using the domestic law and policy and constitutional protections, but also invoking the international human rights standards to embolden their claims. And I think these are extraordinary developments. They can't be replicated elsewhere because, there's such extraordinary diversity in terms of indigenous peoples, but I think that there is some viability. And on the very first question at the outset, I just want to say that when the government of Canada in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly indicated that they wanted to lodge an explanation of vote about the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, the Canadians that were around me said, "Oh, I'm just so embarrassed. We're really embarrassed." And my reply and my answer to them is that don't be embarrassed. Ask them when the next election is, and do the type of educating, informing yourselves, educating, and don't be embarrassed about it, but do something about it in terms of, maybe there's no real difference across the political spectrum. I don't know. I'm an outside observer to it, but I think there are ways and means in which you can impact the potential viability for indigenous peoples here in Canada and elsewhere.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers and all of you who asked questions. I think this has been an incredibly enriching event. So thank you again for coming. Thank you.